Friends, the new Premier of the province of British Columbia,
A victory celebration is getting underway in downtown Vancouver. British Columbians have defeated the Socreds and voted the new Democratic Party into power for just the second time in BC history. The election signals a turning point for the members of the BC Government Employees Union. Tonight marks a new phase in the union's long struggle, a struggle in which the union was compelled to reinvent itself in order to survive and grow. Eight years earlier, in 1983, the union had watched BC voters give another premier a landslide victory.
You here in South Okanagan and the people around the province have given us our first clear majority of over 50% of the vote that any government has received.
After Bill Bennett won his third majority, the social credit government embarked on a process that was ultimately intended to dismantle BC's public service. Phase one of that process was restraint.
In every ministry, in every government office, in every Crown corporation, and in every public body, restraint measures will be taken.
Bill Bennett's July 1983 budget was a direct attack on public services in general and the BCGEU in particular. His restraint program went after human rights, welfare-related services, and labor, initially putting 200,000 public sector workers on notice they could be fired without cause. The firings began almost immediately.
We're family support workers, and child care workers, and you as well, you're family support workers?
Yes, and we were terminated yesterday, and we're picketing to draw attention to that. And we've been directed not to, by the ministry and supervisors, not to talk to the press.
Throughout BC, trade unions and community groups responded quickly by forming Operation Solidarity.
People in this province are very angry, including myself. I'm a housewife, and I really don't have that much to do with any labor unions or anything like that. But I know in a long term, it's going to have an effect on my life.
1983 was to be a summer of protest.
To me, it makes me more determined than ever that we're doing the right thing, because it's quite obvious who the people are and who they represent.
They are calling this a revolution. And it's high time, I think, that we take that seriously and prepare for a response to a revolution. This is an all-out frontal attack against the organization at the democratic roots that will stand in their way of a major change in the society that we are living in. And if we are not fully conscious of the fact that that's what we're engaged in, then we're missing the point.
In early August of 1983, 50,000 people gathered at Vancouver's Empire Stadium to express their anger at the legislation.
If you pass this legislation, every fair-minded person in this province, regardless of religious or political persuasion, will condemn you for trying to crush out the feeling of hope and aspiration of the weakest in our society.
But the provincial government was one step ahead of them. Rally organizers were about to be fired without cause. Among them, the first and second vice presidents of the BCGEU.
Diane Wood and I were working in the organizing of the rally, and we each got word in the middle of that that our jobs would be gone on the 1st of November when the bill came into effect. So not only ourselves, we looked around at the other people that they had announced, and of the I forget how many it was, 600 I think were the initial number, and probably out of that 400 were union activists. And so we began to understand that this was not just an accident. This was part of a plan to really go at the union in a heavy-duty sense.
It really worked against them, though, because I recall going into work sites in bringing people out to demonstrate in the Solidarity Rally, both in Vancouver and Victoria, and members saying to me, you know, we're out there for you because they can't do this to our first and second vice president. And all it did was make them so angry. And I think people that would never have walked out or demonstrated did so because they were so incensed that a government would think of eliminating their leadership.
60,000 people marched on the Social Credit Party's annual convention at the Hotel Vancouver. Inside the hotel, solidarity concerns were heard and dismissed.
Today I want to tell those who oppose us, special interest groups, that while they may have concerns, we will listen. But we will never back down on the policies that we advocate. We look for strength, we look for improvement, but we will not back down on what we set out to do.
The BCGEU was not prepared to back down either.
I trust and hope that this convention will be sending a clear message back to Mr. Bennett. There will be no concessions at the bargaining table from our union.
When contract negotiations with the government broke off, the rank and file voted for an escalating strike.
Actually, I feel pretty excited. I think this could be a part of BC history going down, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
Eventually, the union won a settlement. But Operation Solidarity was over, and the Socreds proceeded with their larger plan, the dismantling of the public service. Between 1983 and 1986, 3,000 BCGEU members lost their jobs.
I remember meeting long-time government employees who just simply got notice that their program was being eliminated. They were out of a job. They had no knowledge of what they were going to do, where they were going to go. In the ministry I worked in, the social service ministry, they sat down and they said to people, you can go to Bella Coola up on the coast. That's the position we'll offer you. Take it or leave it. And people faced with families and roots in the community just said, I can't do that. And they were gone.
This was not a conclusion I came
In May of 1986, after 10 years as Premier, Bill Bennett stepped down.
I stayed longer than the 2 terms that I talked about because
The Bennett dynasty was over. Enter Bill Vander Zalm.
And have a good day in spite of it all.
Bill Vander Zalm, a former Socred cabinet minister and the owner of an $18 million roadside tourist attraction, Fantasy Gardens, promised BC voters prosperity and an end to confrontation.
But all of this can only happen if we tonight again decide, one and all, that we're going to do it together, that we're going to pool as a province for the good of all British Columbia and build from today onward. Thank you very much.
2 weeks into his premiership, Vander Zalm seemed to make good on his promises when he stepped into stalled negotiations between the government and the BCGEU and quickly cut a deal that gave union members more money. But there was more to Bill Vander Zalm's view of industrial relations than met the eye.
We have to make sure we have good industrial relations in our province. Through the changes we've made to Bill 19 and the Job Track program, we'll see new investment and more opportunities here in BC.
Bill 19 was a continuation of the government's plan to dismantle the public service. This phase was an attack on organized labor. Gone would be the province's existing labor code. In its place, a dozen measures designed to weaken the rights of workers and their unions.
The message is this: we won't take it anymore.
Suddenly, BC workers found themselves precisely where they'd been almost 4 years earlier, facing open conflict with the government. This time, they voted for a general strike. On June 1st of 1987, 350,000 workers walked off the job.
Did you head up toward Heather south? Okay.
The strike was an impressive display of labor unity, but Bill Van Der Zalm was just getting started. In the fall of 1987, he dropped a bombshell: massive privatization.
Privatization not simply to raise money to reduce an accumulated deficit, but privatization with a purpose: to create economic development and opportunity like nowhere else in Canada.
The extent of the real Socret agenda was laid bare. $3 billion worth of public assets were to be sold to the private sector. Even the most essential of services were on the auction block.
We intend to apply the same principles to healthcare, education, social services, agriculture, environment. British Columbia is on the move, and there's no stopping us. Thank you.
For the BCGEU, confrontation had now changed to a fight for survival.
I mean, the attack that this union had been faced since 81 or 82 is now intensified. I mean, it's like a major onslaught. The government's out to destroy the union. I mean, here you have highly paid, allegedly committed public employees, and what's their job? Dismantle the public service. I mean, it was a betrayal, a fundamental betrayal of the nature of the public sector, the public services in this province.
When you sit across a table and the chief negotiator for government says to you that they are philosophically, ideologically committed to privatization, you really don't have a lot of other questions that remain unanswered. You know that they're committed to the elimination of the public service, and that means the elimination of the members' jobs that you represent, and of course the elimination of the union.
At first, union members were simply shocked to hear the news.
They're trying to push it too fast. I mean, they haven't even given a person a chance to really think about it.
But their shock soon gave way to anger. And, risking being fired for talking publicly, individual union members spoke out.
It's our jobs, it's our livelihoods, and we have families, and I think we have the right to speak out. Okay. Thanks. Just as the Premier has the right to say what he has to say, we have the right to say what we like to say.
Faced with the darkest period of its history, the BCGEU decided to fight as never before to protect members and their jobs.
But I make today an absolute and total commitment. We will rally our members. We will fight for our jobs. We will protect the public service. And I say to Bill Van Der Zalm, you have no right to do this. You have no right to destroy our heritage. I pledge today the total resources of this union. We are going to stop this insane attack on our way of life. and they are driven by greed and lust for more, and they have all the financial resources in the world to reinforce that power. And what do we have? Well, we have each other. And that's pretty damn good.
In its past confrontations with the government, the BCGEU had used traditional means, strikes and walkouts, to get its message across. But now that the Premier proposed to do away with the public service altogether, new responses were added to the traditional tools of unions. The union set aside $500,000 to create and run an advertising campaign designed to show the people of BC why privatization was not in the public interest.
They call it privatization. It's where the provincial government sells off all its public responsibilities. Some things are more important than profit, like you and your family.
Our teenage daughter's in trouble. Drugs. We can't afford the private clinics, and the government's cut its programs. It seems like they just don't give up.
My brother gets confused. He gets picked up by the police. He's not a criminal. He's mentally ill. And now the government's put him out on the street. They just don't care.
Remember that come election day.
That campaign was extremely successful. We swung the public from being 2-to-1 in favor of privatization to 2-to-1 opposed to privatization. We garnered a lot of public support. The government lost any level of public approbation for privatization, and so they stopped the high-level stuff.
In addition to its advertising campaign, the BCGEU enlisted many community organizations and municipal governments to fight privatization.
We asked municipal councils to pass resolutions opposing liquor privatization. And 58 municipal councils in British Columbia, which at that time were the SOCRED farm teams, they said they were opposed to liquor privatization.
We also entered into the public debate in a much more detailed manner. We did critiques of what was wrong with forestry policy from the public point of view, from the resource point of view, from the conservation point of view, and from an economic point of view. And we let the public know that we had many of the same interests they did, and that we had the members with the expertise to comment on it. We were so successful at that the government in the late 80s and the early 90s wouldn't think now, I believe, of setting up any kind of hearing process on forestry matters without considering the BCGEU one of the interested parties.
The BCGEU succeeded in protecting some public services, but still thousands of members were fired.
It's pretty hard to sit down and to be meeting and speaking with people, and you have people that have worked most of their working life in a job with the government and are being told, you don't have this anymore, and to see those people break down. And there was a lot of that. There was a lot of dealing with the human side, and we tried so hard to make people understand that, you know, these are not just numbers. These are real people with real lives. And the human side of what the government did, that story has never been told. We saw it in the union every day. And some people have never recovered, and they never will. And I'll never forgive the government for that. Never.
As privatization forced more and more members out of the public service, the BCGEU followed them and continued to represent them in negotiations with their new private sector employers.
Not only was our membership falling, and we could see ourselves, if we could wither on the vine, and there are other public sector unions around the world that have chosen to do that, maybe not because they wanted to, but either the internal membership wasn't interested in going outside of their traditional jurisdiction, in quotes, or people just didn't have the foresight to do that. Well, we did, and predecessors to me did. And so we went out and organized in areas that BC Government Employees Union was not traditionally involved with.
As a result of its fight for survival, the BCGEU emerged both strengthened and enriched by its newfound diversity.
I think it's very healthy for the union to have a mix because you don't get this sort of tunnel vision from being strictly in one sector or the other. And each side works together to give their experiences and their knowledge to the other side. And I think that that's worked very successful for us, and I think it's a real healthy mix.
There's more members with more expectations of what a union should be. There's more members who are prepared to be involved in their union, and there are more members who will not accept the union not doing things.
Meanwhile, over in Fantasy Gardens, after 5 rocky years in office, Bill Vander Zalm had finally made a fatal mistake.
Hello, nice to see you.
The government's Conflict of Interest Commissioner ruled that the Premier had used the powers of his office to facilitate the sale of Fantasy Gardens to interests in the Far East. Improprieties had already forced many of his cabinet ministers to step down. Now it was the Premier's turn.
Yesterday, in meetings with my lawyers, I was encouraged by the strength of their submissions to Mr. Hughes, and I believed that the findings would be favorable. Regrettably, the findings are not what I had expected.
Who's the Premier, sir?
A longtime Vander Zalm ally, Rita Johnson, took over as Premier. For the BCGEU, the future looked a lot like the past.
You've still got a vestige of government, but it doesn't stop the problem. The problem is that the government wants to go out of the business of governing. It wants to eliminate public services because it believes that private is good and public is bad. So, I mean, that requires a change in government. The answer becomes, honestly, a political solution.
Good morning, Richard West Campaign Office.
When the next provincial election was called in the fall of 1991, the BCGEU was ready to wage one more battle. Determined to have a greater say in who their next employer would be, union members worked on the campaign to defeat the Socreds.
Joint is going to go around to all the campaign offices, so my car cart will be here tomorrow night.
The victory on October 17, 1991, signaled an end to the war. The defeat of the Socreds opened the possibility of a new relationship with government. Negotiations with the new government might not be any easier, but at least there would be negotiations. Since that night, there have been many achievements. Government-imposed wage controls were lifted and collective bargaining for public employees resumed. Bill 19, the labor law favoring management, was eliminated. The government confirmed its commitment to public services through the Corbyn Commission and many concrete initiatives. And the government also moved forward in implementing pay equity and employment equity. Through the good times and bad, The BCGEU has grown and changed and never lost sight of its purpose: to represent all its members with uncompromising determination and honor.
There's not anything you can't do if you decide you have to do it. People say, oh, what can we do to change things? Boy, in this union, we changed a lot of things in a fairly short period of time. The SOCREDs are history, and we're still here.
I see a union that is a bit smaller, but is more dynamic, more democratic, much more broadly based, and a lot stronger, and a hell of a lot smarter than it was in 1981 and 1982.
Like the boat that righted itself, and we bailed it out, we built new hatches, and we sewed new sails, but the crew is stronger. The crew knows that they can survive in that process, and people are looking to us.
We're still here. We're still standing up tall. We're still strong. We didn't lay down for a minute. And I think we're well positioned for the future. It's lots of work ahead and lots of challenges, but we know what we have to do.